Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's waiting in line to swear in as a Member of Parliament. Just behind me is my hated rival who narrowly beat me in the race to become President of the Oxford Union. It's Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Corey.
And just in front of me is someone clutching a battered pamphlet on full employment he's hoping to publish. It's Shane Whaley. Hello, Shane.
How are you, gentlemen? It's great to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you. Very well, thank you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. So my name is Shane Whaley, of no political affiliation. I am the host, producer, and founder of Spybury, which is the online hub for all things spy fiction and espionage history. But it's quite interesting with the Spybury thing is we have a no politics rule. So I don't cover geopolitics. I don't cover modern events, but I'm actually a bit of a political anorak when it comes to reading material. So I have not as big as my Spybury, but plenty of books on British politics, and even more obscure is East Germany politics as well, and the history of East Germany. So very much interested in political fiction podcast.
So we're doing First Among Equals this week. It's a TV series which is based on the Jeffrey Archer novel. So give us a minute to take the oath and check our racks for messages, and then we'll proceed to the first reading. So first item on the agenda is Events du Bois. So Shane, as you say, you picked this from your vast collection of UK political fiction. Why this one?
So it's a book I remember reading. I was probably around 15, so around 1990. And, I was thinking about it earlier on today. I don't know how I discovered, because obviously this is pre-internet. I wasn't reading grown-up newspapers at that time, so I wouldn't have read a review. I'm guessing I probably found it in a jumble sale. Thought, well, this sounds interesting. I'd obviously heard of Archer. I never read any of his stuff, but sufficiently interested to give it a go. And I probably read that book 3 times in my kind of mid to late teens. And then I was delighted to discover the TV series. And it was at a time where, our school didn't teach politics. They just about brought economics in at A-level. So there was no political science. So that book was actually my guidebook to Whitehall and Parliament. And I know we'll get into this a bit, but that was, it kind of taught me quite a lot about what happens in SW1.
I'd not read this before. What's interesting actually about this is we've just started inviting guests, and First Among Equals it's the most requested book that we've had. Admittedly, that's not a huge sample of guests and not a big sample, but I hadn't really heard of it before emailing out to guests. So I was kind of intrigued to find out what all the fuss was about.
Well, you're of the generation that has luckily sort of escaped Jeffrey Archer in many ways, aren't you? Because back in the 1980s, he was just an absolutely massive literary, one would almost say titan. I mean, there is a fantastic quote which I cannot resist slipping in this early in the in our podcast episode from the paperback edition of First Amongst Equals, which I've got, and it's this Scotsman newspaper. So, this is a pretty reputable source. Says, we haven't had a better novel about Parliament since Anthony Trollope gave us Phineas Finn. I mean, putting Jeffrey Archer in the Anthony Trollope category would have been done with a straight face in the 1980s, and now would cause everyone to sort of smirk and laugh. I think there was a point at which he was not just a hugely popular figure, but seen as a really high quality writer in a way that has aged, I think, quite badly. So I came across his novel, I think probably just on the shelf of the local bookshop. It had passed me by until Shane mentioned it, that there had been a TV adaptation. I'm not quite sure how I missed that, but I read the novel first in the sort of late 1980s, which is at just the time that real politics was sort of mirroring what's in the book. So the book is all about political parties, hung parliaments, new parties, etc. And the 1980s was the Alliance heyday. So it's it's a trip down memory lane for 2 of the 3 of us, at least, on this episode.
The nearest I probably got to the equivalent of the T series of First Among Equals is House of Cards, which I suppose is sort of similar in a way, that you've got a mini-series, late 80s, written by someone who was a political insider.
I mean, it feels really cruel to bracket House of Cards with Jeffrey Archer. You're right at the time, I guess, similar-ish. But I think one has aged an awful lot better than the other. I do just love the paperback edition that I've got is just so 1980s. There's this big embossed sort of gold writing on the front, these four main characters, because it's a 1980s novel. The four main characters are all men. Their four partners are all on the back, all women. They're all massively bouffant dynasty sort of Dallas style hairstyles for them all. It's just so 1980s.
It is. And so I haven't read the book in 30 years probably. And I'm glad I didn't pick up a US edition because I live in the United States, because I found out that in the US, they radically changed the book. So Andrew Fraser does not appear in the book. They took him out completely. And apparently the reason for that was...
Wow, oh, that explains the online review that I really had made a note of to make fun of, because, sorry to just jump in like this, because it's a book that's about four people. There are four people on the cover. When you open it, it gives you a little mini bio of these four people. And there's this online review that I read a couple of days ago, which talks about the three people. And I was gonna think, oh, ha ha ha, you know, silly online review. So really, they cut out a whole character in the US version of the novel.
They did. I mean, you must have thought that was like the Spectator there, completely ignoring the... You must have thought that was like the Spectator, completely ignoring the Lib Dems there, Mark.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting because they took him out apparently because Americans wouldn't understand a multi-party system. And then also the other thing that Archer has said, this is incredible. At the end of the book, the ending is changed. So I don't know if we can go into this. So,
no spoilers, please. No
I think
spoilers.
I think we'll do spoilers in the next one.
Right. So there is a big change at the end because of American attitudes, apparently.
Ooh,
but
surprised me. So I'm so glad I didn't pick that up.
I think the UK book and the TV series also have different endings, don't they? So there are 3 different endings in circulation. Wow.
Yeah.
But I'm just befuddled at the idea that you have a book based around 4 characters, and I get that when books go in either direction across the Atlantic, you sometimes have changes made. But to cut out a whole character, I mean, that's just...
Americans wouldn't get a multi-party. I mean, they're not that dim. They would get it.
There's the old music album. I think about the Elvis Costello albums, or I think Kinks albums, or maybe Rolling Stones albums. They're often the US ordering is different because there are some tracks that.
But this is like cutting out the guitar.
And what they did apparently was that some of the storylines that affect Andrew Fraser, certainly in his personal life, they gave that to another character. They gave it to Kerslake.
I should just also say on the basis of being confused, if you go to Amazon Prime to think, oh, can I watch First Amongst Equals? There is a political show called First Amongst Equals that comes up, but that is actually I think it's a documentary, might be a docudrama about Nancy Astor, so one of the pioneering female politicians, but not an adaptation of the Jeffrey Archer novel.
I think also from memory, and this has been 30 years, that they also in this change. So they say Seymour won the presidency of Oxford Union, but in the book, I'm pretty sure it was Kerslake.
Well, I think they changed. So I think that's a change that's also done between the book and the TV version.
Yes.
And I've not reread enough of the novel, because it is a long Jeffrey Archer novel. I've not reread it to work out why they might have made that change. But it feels like we are jumping all over the agenda.
Sorry, my fault.
Episode, Corey. You need to bring us to order.
Right. I'm going to... If I had a gavel, which obviously I don't, because this is about the British Parliament, then I would hit it. But so we're going to do something slightly different. Which isn't to talk about the 3 different versions gone parallel, but we'll talk about the first episode in a bit of detail. And then we will reconvene next time and we'll do a spoiler-tastic about the next 10 episodes or the next 9 episodes.
Well, I'm hoping we do a good enough job so your many listeners around the globe will go to the YouTube channel that you'll share in your show notes and watch it along with us. So by the time you record episode 10, everyone will be up to speed, because... Well, we'll get into it in this conversation. I think it is worth watching.
Yeah, we should see we should see what the YouTube figures are before and after this episode comes out. When it turns out like the most trending video on YouTube isn't Taylor Swift; it's actually a 1980s political drama. There we go. That'll be why. So, so as much plot as you need to get you through is where we'll go with this in the start of the next section. So, First Among Equals focused on 4 different MPs and their wives and their various parliamentary scheming. And so the first episode takes place just after the 1964 election and mirrors the events of that time. So in the novel, I suppose, the character. You have the actual Ted Heath, the actual Harold Wilson, whereas the main sort of political event that's happening in the episode we're about to talk about, a Conservative leadership election contest between a fictional Ted Heath and a fictional Reggie Maudling, and a PM who is almost but not quite Harold Wilson. I'm going to take control of this agenda with all the President's Men. Next item, which is cast and crew. I think we've talked about there's 4 different people you probably need to know. So I think it's worth talking about them just so we've got a bit of a grounding of who we're talking about. And Shane, just to bring you up to speed, what usually happens here is I spend half an hour talking about the complete IMDb history of most of the people which then gets edited out to about 2 minutes. So to save us that, what I've tried to do is find one big political figure that each of the actors has played. First off, we've got Raymond Gould. He's an MP for Leeds, former lawyer. He writes earnest pamphlets. So what you need to know about Gould is he's the earnest kind of writes about full employment. He's played by Tom Wilkinson, dead famous, the politician. He's LBJ in Selma. Good to have LBJ on the podcast again. So James Faulkner plays Simon Kerslake. So Simon Kerslake, what you basically need to know about Simon Kerslake, he's the schemy one, but his schemes never seem to quite come off. So he's a Tory MP, won marginally in Coventry Central, and he played Herod Agrippa in I, Claudius. But he's also been in lots of other stuff. David Robb is Andrew Fraser, who is shamefully written out of the US version because 3 parties is too many parties, as I'm sure Mark would agree. So David Robb plays Andrew Fraser, and his family's high Tory, but he's a Labour MP in this episode. He's basically the cad for reasons we'll get into in one of our categories. And politician, he plays Tom Boleyn in Wolf Hall, the adaptation of the book. And then the 4th one, Jeremy Childs plays Charles Seymour, who's a Tory. He has the best house of all the MPs. My wife was very jealous of the house he has in Kensington. He's Tory MP for Sussex, and he plays Francis Pym in the Falklands play. And he's the suave one. Jeremy Childs is very much high Tory out of central casting, isn't he?
And apparently he did go to Eton. His dad was a baronet, worked in the Foreign Office, so he almost played. And I've not seen him in a great deal, Corey, but he also played a role in The Sweeney, and it was a similar character there. He was part of the establishment elite Sloane Square set that was being reading all the info on what was happening at upper class things that I know very little about. Jeremy Child apparently appears in a 1993 Labour Party political broadcast alongside Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry. Haven't been able to track that down anymore.
Oh, that was quite a famous one. I do remember that one. But is he playing a sort of Tory toff as the sort of counterpart to Fry and Laurie?
Maybe that's it. Because I always assume that they are supporting the party if they're doing it. So he doesn't strike me as a Labour Party activist. That's the point I was trying to make.
We'll have to see if we can dig out. We must have someone who's got back issues of Labour Party political broadcasts that they can upload from VHS to YouTube, do the democratic service. First Among Equals is probably the show that launches their careers, isn't it? I think certainly Tom Wilkinson kind of is what makes his name, isn't it? Because he then becomes he's the biggest of all 4 in terms of the acting, in terms of the films he was in, I suppose.
He's another one of those actors, Corey, that got fame later in life, because he wasn't on my radar. I think The Full Monty was his breakthrough moment, and then suddenly he was getting these Hollywood roles. So I think that's what made him. But the other 3, I would say, you see them, like I just mentioned, The Sweeney or Minder or these 80s, they'll pop up in things. And admittedly, I don't watch much TV that was produced after 2000 unless it's espionage related, so maybe they have, but
thankfully I do. I can fill in the gaps there, because you can definitely play 70s, 80s, 90s TV bingo with a lot of this cast.
Yes.
Again, we should mention the female members of the cast as well. So Joanna David and Jane Booker, who you will recognise, play 2 of the wives, but also probably maybe the most famous member of 90s TV bingo, Hyacinth Bucket's husband from Keeping Up Appearances, is in this episode as a common sense bluff Tory MP.
The thing I found a bit confusing about them all was, in the novel, you've got the real political leaders, but the 4 main characters are, got fictional names, fictional people. In the TV, both sets are. And I was just thinking some of these names sound a bit familiar, and it took me a while to realise is that just by, I don't know if you call it good luck or bad luck, when Jeffrey Archer made up the names of his four main characters, brackets 3 for American listeners, he ended up picking names that match up with the real names of some unconnected but very involved in politics people. So Simon Kerslake, career Conservative politician in the book. In real life, if that name is sounding a bit familiar to anyone, that's because there was a Simon Kerslake who was head of the civil service. Andrew Fraser, the one who gets dropped for the Americans, Labour MP in the book, but Conservative Party treasurer and peer in real life. And so you just have, these names all sound slightly familiar in the wrong way, which is really, really unusual.
That feels quite conceptual, though, doesn't it? A lot of the episodes felt it's almost like real life, but not quite.
We normally only talk about the cast, but we should perhaps particularly mention the political advisors who are given credits for this, partly because one of them is a colleague of mine in the House of Lords, still in the Lib Dem group, Tom McNally, and I think it's Joan Lester is the other one. So,
did you speak to Tom about this prior to interview, about his recollections of being?
No, I haven't. I should do. I should ask him.
Maybe
what
for the next one.
Yeah,
that's your homework, Mark.
Absolutely.
But
homework duly noted.
Okay, next, put it on the agenda next Lib Dem Lords. You can't have anything else. We are recording while Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister. So at the moment, there is very little for the Lords to be doing. So this is prime time to be...
Correction, we are recording while Keir Starmer is in his first term as Prime Minister. Don't forget, we've got to leave the option open for the dramatic return.
Correct.
Moving swiftly on from that, the other thing we should mention, again, just as part of 80s TV bingo, I noticed the music's by Richard Harvey. And we will definitely talk about the music in the Zeitgeist tape. But any other fans of 80s political dramas, he also did the music for GBH, which is a good, because he did that with Elvis Costello. So it's nice to be able to have a reference to Elvis Costello on the podcast. Next item, Art for the Possible. Any similarities between this book and real events? There's some interesting stuff about the lifestyles of MPs in the 60s compared to now, isn't there? About the salary to an MP, essentially you get £1,750 a year in indigestion. That's one of the quips, isn't it? Yeah.
I was very struck by that being essentially the backstory to the MP's expenses scandal that happens several decades later. And obviously it doesn't excuse the MP's expenses scandal, but you can see how we ended up in an era where so many MPs thought it was acceptable in some way to try to milk the expenses rules, because there had been a real sense of MPs feeling like they were poorly paid. Certainly their salaries at the time were quite decent compared to what a lot of other people would have been on, but there was definitely a very strong culture, which this TV adaptation brings out really powerfully, really quite early on, about MPs feeling poorly paid.
There's a lot of classism in the book and the TV series, and there's that one line from Ray Gould, the new Labour MP's wife, who sat next to Seymour's wife in the public galleries. They're getting sworn in, and she said, "Oh, he's off now to sign in because you don't get paid until you sign in." And obviously, you can tell at that point that Seymour doesn't need the money. That's pocket money to him, whereas for the Labour Yorkshire family, that money is very important. I like that nod.
Yeah, the fact that you've got MPs who are lawyers who are having to they're still doing their practice, or Kerslake, is writing articles about the Beeching report to try and get a bit of extra cash, which I feel like now it would all there'd be lots of kind of constituency business, wouldn't there, and all that kind of stuff. But that isn't really a part of this. You've basically either got the political scheming or you've got MPs complaining about how broke they are.
It's true. I think if you were to do a similar drama now and to try to make it reasonably lifelike, the initial experience of being an MP would have to involve feeling completely swamped at the volume of contacts you suddenly have from constituents, even for people who were previously a councillor or whatever. That is a big part of the initial impact in a way that, just doesn't. Do any constituents feature in episode 1? I'm struggling to think.
There is a nod to that, though, Mark, when they're at the pigeonhole collecting, and he says something like, letters from people I don't know who they are. There is a little mention.
But look at how small those pigeonholes are. Look at how little mail you can get. Those pigeonholes, I think, still exist, because I walked past the pigeonholes for MPs just the other day for real, and they are very, very thin pigeonholes, although now that is because so much is electronic. But I think they will have been the same pigeonholes even back then, vastly less contact from voters than MPs get now.
And there's the throwaway line, isn't there, about someone says they want to try and go into politics as a career, and they say there's three types of MPs who go into politics as a career: the rich, the broke, and the foolhardy. It's one of those bon mots where you think, is that true, or does it just sound witty? I'm not sure. You sort of mentioned this in your notes, the fact that Labour MPs are either sort of teachers or lawyers.
But Corey, as you know, a Labour man must not be seen to be too self-sufficient.
No, well,
in the movie, that's what he says. Do I have to be a teacher or a lawyer? I thought that was quite funny.
That little sort of trio, though, is quite amusing, given Jeffrey Archer's own dalliance with politics himself. I guess in the end he ended up all three.
I don't know much. I genuinely don't know much about his political career. So I mostly know Jeffrey Archer as being the butt of jokes on Have I Got News for You when I was a teenager. Was he a successful?
Well, the final arc of his political career was being the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London, wasn't it, for a little while? Something that Danny Finkelstein is always amusingly very, very critical of. But he had been an MP from, what was it, 69 to 74, I think, or six. Yeah. So overlapping, with the early period of the book and the TV series. So he's such a controversial character that it's a little bit hard to know to what extent that sort of, those sorts of jibes are amusing self-deprecation or arrogance on his part.
Because wasn't he party chairman for a while or treasurer? Something.
Yeah,
as well?
And then the personal scandals all brought his sort of they didn't bring his political career to as much of an end as they should have initially, but eventually the scandals did for him.
He did time, didn't he? He did time in prison. A bit like Jonathan Aitken.
Yeah, although I fear that's a little unfair to Jonathan Aitken. I think Jonathan Aitken does seem to be the perfect role model for how you should behave once you've been caught up in scandal and crisis and reality has hit you in the face. He does seem to have led quite an admirable life, subsequently becoming a passionate advocate for legal reform, and seems to have genuinely found religion and been a net positive to society, I guess, since then, in a way that very much wasn't so earlier.
Very similar to Profumo, right? Didn't he go off to?
Yeah, exactly. Profumo, Profumo, again, very admirable life. And also, particularly in Profumo's case, I think Profumo had more of a reason to feel bitter about the scandal. I think, Aitken and Archer undoubtedly did things that were wrong. Profumo also did, but in a way that not, at least in my moral book, not as seriously wrong. I mean, lying to the Commons was really foolish, but fundamentally he had an affair and then lied in the Commons about it. That's much more benign than I think what some of the others got up to.
And speaking of net benefits to society, we should speak about political journalists, because one of the lines I liked, that becoming editor of the magazine would be the last refuge of a scoundrel, which, given we've been talking about former mayors of London, feels somewhat appropriate.
And of course, at the time, that this is sort of set, and at the time that Archer was an MP, that was the era of Ian MacLeod being editor of The Spectator and Michael Foot being editor of Tribune. I can see somebody of saying Jeffrey Archer's politics describing Michael Foot as a scoundrel, but it seems a bit mean on Ian MacLeod as well to bracket them together.
What about the current editor of The Spectator?
Making no comment on whether he's a scoundrel or not. He does do quite a good one-man House of Commons reenactment society in the House of Lords. I think he whether deliberately or just because he hasn't quite got the tone of the place yet, does behave rather more like an MP than a peer when he's in the House of Lords at the moment.
If we're going to start talking Michael Gove chat, we're going to go seriously off topic. I will just mention to listeners that if you want to hear Mark and I talk about Michael Gove, you can go to the Brexit, the Uncivil War episode in which he has a cameo. But Michael Gove's segue to the Oxford Union is the fact that you've got politicians who are rivals at university, and these rivalries sort of carry on into adulthood. I feel the tone of that feels about right, because becoming president of the Oxford Union, that was people like Ted Heath were president there, weren't they? And that was the thing that set them up. And even just to get our obligatory Peter Mandelson reference in, the fact that you've got Peter Mandelson going against William Hague for the Oxford Chancellorship recently, these kind of Oxbridge rivalries play out over the years. Yeah,
it's a very sort of narrow but important perspective on politics. Those sort of Oxbridge rivalries playing out then through the rest of people's political careers.
Shall we finish this section with my beheading fact? Because
that sounds ominous.
It's what happens if we stray too much off topic. So Fraser says that the last man to be beheaded in public in the UK was a Fraser. So I wanted to check that. And it was. So Simon Fraser in 1747. So Simon Fraser was the 11th Lord Lovat. And so he was executed for his part in the Jacobite rebellion in 1745. So he was sort of in hiding after Culloden, and then the English found him and beheaded him. I wanted to check.
Because Lord Lovat in the Second World War led the commandos at D-Day. If you watch The Longest Day, he's the one with the piper next to him.
Oh,
so
right.
Lord Lovat of that. There's quite a distinguished family there.
Yeah.
Very brave man.
That's an arc. They should do that as a TV series. I would watch the history of that family.
Also, I think what I picked up on in terms of real life events, and Mark, you know this because you work at the place, but there was a scene where Seymour gets shown his office, and you can see, he's used to grandeur and luxury, and he looks at this pokey little office and says, wow, it's not much room. And he goes, yeah, you're sharing with 3 other MPs, which I thought, I don't know what it's like now, Mark, with
but that's certainly what it used to be like, particularly before, for example, Portcullis House was built. And in fact, I remember going to meet a Lib Dem MP. It must have been in the late 90s, going into this little crowded space with papers piled everywhere and their assistants sat at a desk. And I assumed that the door on the left was then the door through to the MP's office. But no, that was a cupboard. That was the whole office. So yeah, it was. MPs used to have ludicrously tiny office spaces quite often, and therefore the internal party politics over who got allocated what office was, particularly vociferous, because the difference in offices was massive.
The other thing I picked up on, and again, this is how this book taught me a lot about British politics and certainly the parliamentary system, was the whips pairing. So you've got that scene with Fraser and Kerslake, and he says, would you pair with me? So it means we can both have a night off together. We don't have to go to vote. And it doesn't necessarily add much to the story unless something comes in later on. I can't quite recall now. But as a teenager, I was like, I didn't know they did. I didn't really know what the whipping system was. So I remember it sent me off down a rabbit hole to read about that, but also how the way they explain, particularly, to our American friends or our international audience who may not be aware of this either. It is very educational.
I think the pairing is always organised by the whips rather than individually, MPs picking their pair. But I think that way that's done is very deft, because it is a good bit of exposition that is done in a way that feels quite natural rather than clunky. So for all the other derogatory comments I've made about how Geoffrey Archer shouldn't be compared with Trollope, you can see why he was such a massively successful best-selling author.
And it's quite a good bit of character setting as well, isn't it? Because it's Kerslake asks Gould, doesn't he? So it already sets Kerslake. Oh, sorry, yeah. He has Fraser, doesn't he? So it sort of sets Kerslake up as this person who's he knows the patch already. He's a new MP, but he knows the system. But also he's already trying to scheme and get MPs to do things for him, which maybe mirrors quite well the fact that he starts, calling through MPs at midnight to add to his spreadsheet as well.
Definitely. But I think it also showed me that, MPs can be quite friendly to each other, even though they're different parties. Again, I'm going back to the lens when I was 15 years of age, where I just thought they all hated each other because all I had for reference was PMQs on TV. But seeing that, okay, they do actually get on outside of the pantomime of PMQs.
And I think just going back to the office sharing, that's how Tony Blair and Gordon Brown became close friends and allies, isn't it? Because I don't think they knew each other before 1983, and then were shoved together and then kind of developed that rapport. So yeah, I guess who gets offices together and who doesn't can sometimes be quite consequential. Next item, Phil Willis Award, most evil or Machiavellian character in this book. So obviously this is just the first episode. Might not be the same answer when we finish this, but it's either going to be Kerslake for his continuous scheming, or it's Fraser for rather caddish treatment of his girlfriend.
I hope your wife isn't going to listen to this episode if you're describing Fraser's behaviour as only rather caddish. I mean, being all set up to announce your engagement to the family and then dumping your fiancée for someone else on that very evening, I think is more than somewhat caddish.
I think for our American listeners, that's typical British understatement.
Especially as he's chatting her up at the event. He sat on the table with her, trying to seduce her in front of the whole family and everything. It's not just he's doing this clandestine. He's in front of everybody.
But and also, and I know this is a political fictions podcast. It's not. Don't come for us for relationship
adultery
advice.
Podcast. Is that how you?
Well, adulterous fictions are a very different kind of show. But Fraser and his almost fiance, at least have chemistry. Whereas Fraser and the person he rather caddishly leaves her for, they have no chemistry whatsoever. It doesn't really seem to make any sense to me. But
in the tradition of this podcast, I did really try really hard to spot a child who I could claim was the real Machiavellian schemer, but I failed, at least on episode 1.
Let's move on. Barack Obama's tan suit. Best and worst bits of political detail. Shane, do you want to kick off with a set?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I remember, I'm not sure, what year was it when PMQs was televised? Was it 1990 or 89, around that time?
It was when Brian Gould was a Labour frontbencher. I remember that because he had this hairstyle that had to change because of the camera angle. So there was a generation of MPs who had these very bouffant hairstyles with hair thinning on top, but their hair swept forward. So they looked like when you normally saw them, very bouffant hairstyle. But the problem was the angle of the cameras in the House of Commons when the Commons started being televised was to look down. So it looked like everyone had these toupees that had just slipped forward a bit. And Brian Gould was particularly striking. So it was that era. And Brian Gould, stood and failed spectacularly, didn't he, in a Labour leadership election, which was to succeed Neil Kinnock. So it must have been around then.
Yes. Yeah. I think it was late 80s, wasn't it? Because I think there is footage of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister in the House of Commons, I think, isn't there? With the no. That's how
I want to say 89, 90. Yeah. How I feel it was. But my point is, I remember coming home from school and whereas other kids would watch, I don't know, Blue Peter or whatever was on, I wanted to watch PMQs. I found the whole thing fascinating. And even to this day, Mark very kindly gave me tea at the Lords, and Charles Maynard MP gave me a tour when I was over last. And, that magic of whatever one thinks of the political process and what's happening in politics, that place just still takes my breath away. I have that respect and reverence for it. So seeing that, for me, although there's one omission, which one of you has spotted, and I'll let you, I won't steal your thunder with the set, it feels authentic. It felt really, I mean, at one point, even thought, gosh, have they actually filmed this at the Commons? Did they get permission to do this? Because it's not just the chamber, it's the room before you go in, the lobby that you go into the chamber. It looks very realistic to me. So it's definitely the set. I think they've gone to some effort. And I was reading online that apparently they used it. It was at the Granada TV studios, and it was part of a tour you could do there. And then somebody bought it. They made a show, which I haven't seen, and actually bought the set, rented it out. But now apparently it's in storage in Oxfordshire somewhere. So maybe we need to get the aforementioned Charlie Maynard to find out where that is, because I think that should be in a school or somewhere, quite frankly. But
it's the set gets used a few years later in another TV drama about politics, which Corey and I are doing a later episode of this podcast about. And so it did rather confuse me when I saw the same set appear twice. Excellent. And as you say, it's a really good set. It has one fewer rows of seats than the actual House of Commons. It took me a little while to twig what it was. There was something that looked not quite right. And in the end, I thought, hang on a minute, let's just count the rows of seats. But other than that, and the other thing is not just the set is really good, is I think at least in episode 1, they get how MPs sit right. This is something I had a real mini rant about in our episode on the Iron Lady, you may remember, Corey, that they've got everyone sat there just neatly lined up in a way that's not how MPs actually sit. They slouch a bit and they're, different places on different rows and so on. And they've got paper. It just looks like the House of Commons in a way that for all that the stage set is okay in the Iron Lady, it just doesn't look right when it's got people in. Here, it does look right.
It captures very much what they would not have called in the 80s the vibe of the Commons. So my favourite bit of detail is in that set, and it's when MPs are taking the oath. And it kind of comes back to what we were saying about the differences between MPs now and the differences between MPs then, because I literally wrote in my notes, this is like they're all at school, and then someone said it in the TV show, which was a bit spooky. But the process now, it's very much, because it's televised, to your point, Shane, it's much more solemn. There's silence. It's pretty dignified, and everything gets clipped for social media. Whereas when it's done in the episode, it's a shambolic. Everyone's talking. It's kind of 2 minute. It's getting everyone through as quickly as they can, isn't it? A bit like kind of giving someone the school dinner vouchers or something. It is that kind of formula. It's not just the hairstyles and some of the rhetoric that you get now that MPs are filmed, but it's the style in which Parliament takes place as well.
There was one scene, I don't know if this is allowed, maybe Mark, you will know the answer to this, where Gould is sat where the Prime Minister usually sits on the front bench, and he's having a discussion about with one of his colleagues, and then the then Prime Minister walks by and says, "Oh, you try my seat on for size." Are they allowed to sit on that?
Yeah, I guess that could happen, because I guess if you're in the chamber in the morning before the formal sitting has started, you might just sit down, and I mean you could do that at the moment. I guess if you're an MP, you would be allowed into the chamber. I think they're a little bit more tight on access now for security reasons. So there's a point at which the police and their sniffer dogs, the current sniffer dog, or one of the current sniffer dogs who's used in the Commons, is so cute, unbelievably cute pooch. Hopefully also pretty good at sniffing out explosions.
We should try and get them on the podcast.
So it might be a little bit, but basically, yeah, there are other times. I mean, I did this in the House of Lords shortly after I joined. I slipped into the chamber when the House wasn't sitting, so I could just sort of sit where I would be giving my maiden speech and just sort of get a moment to think about, well, where will I be? What will be where's the microphone I need to make sure I'm near, etc. So I think, I can imagine that having happened for real, something like that, with somebody cheekily sitting on the front bench in the Prime Minister's seat.
Yeah, I did wonder about that. Is that just a no-no? Or, I'm not that superstitious of a guy, but I think, I better not sit there just in case it jinxes me or whatever, or how it will look. What are the optics of that? Anyway, I just wondered about it when I watched that on the show.
No, it's like that famous photo of Harold Wilson outside the door of number 10, isn't it? When he's an infant. You're setting up expectations, aren't you? What are the details? Yeah, so we mentioned the pigeonholes, the racks.
Yeah, so one of the other bits I like, which is just so spot on, there are, over each political generation, there's a clutch of bag carriers who end up having this job of being at the Prime Minister or the party leader's elbow and just whispering to them who it is that they're about to meet. And in this case, it's the name, profession, seat, and whether their majority is big or small. That gets whispered to the PM before. And, you can imagine with Keir Starmer, for example, when he took over as Prime Minister for the first time after 2024, a general election, just all of these Labour MPs who understandably would expect him to recognise who they were. But how on earth do you memorise all of those names? So, straight away, let alone a little bit of detail about them. So that whispering in the ear is a very real job that lots of people have done over the years.
I guess listeners can judge for themselves how well Keir Starmer managed to judge his relationship with his parliamentary party. But I like the detail of the fact it's a good majority of the unspoken.
Yeah.
The majority
they might be here for a while.
Yeah, the majority is only 50. You don't need to worry about that. Actually, no, 20,000 majority in Leeds. You're going to need to know who this person is. Yeah. I like that.
There's one detail I obviously wish to disassociate myself from completely, which is the quip from Andrew Fraser. I don't believe in horoscopes. They're like opinion polls. You believe what you want to believe. For the record, horoscopes and opinion polls are very different.
Although they are different, but is the sentiment of people...
No, but they are different. Full stop.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, I might move on from that touchy subject. Any final details you like, Shane, before we move on?
There is a quote in the book that I remember, actually, despite the fact it's 30 years ago, talking about majorities, where they say something like, they don't count the vote in Surrey Downs, they weigh it for the Tories. Which I thought was really good imagery, because I think he has something like a 28,000 majority. He doesn't have to care about campaigning or anything. He can focus on trying to get to the top, whereas Kerslake is in a tiny majority.
Complete digression, but it does sort of follow from that point about how sometimes majorities are so big that you sort of feel like you don't really need to count them. I remember there was a parliamentary by-election in the 1990s that I was working on for the Lib Dems, and myself and Paul, who was the sort of the party HQ staffer who was running the thing, both of us, we went to meet the returning officer and to just talk about a few of the things around submitting nomination papers, postal votes, the basic sort of logistics. Very common conversation you have. And at the end of the conversation, the returning officer said, and I guess as it's a by-election, with a bit of national attention, you're going to expect us to count all the votes this time. Sort of cue puzzled silence from Paul and I for a moment, and then one of us said, "Yes, I mean, what is it that you normally?" And you see what they used to do, because the seat had been rock solid Labour for so long, is they used to do the verification, so you know how many ballot papers you've got in total in the ballot boxes, and then rather than split them into the vote counts for each party and adding up each candidate's votes, they'd do everyone but Labour. And then they just say, well, we know all the votes for all the non-Labour people. All the rest must be the votes for Labour, and just subtract one from the other rather than counting the Labour votes. So, I mean, credit to the returning officer for realising he needed to actually do the count properly this time. But
them were the days.
Them were the days.
I mean, it wouldn't happen now for a number of reasons, I guess fair to say. Next item, a very British coup. Are there any conspiracy theories? Short answer is no. Longer answer is not unless you count spreadsheet-based conspiracies. I think we can draw a veil over that and go on to, I mean, there's definitely stuff in here. How to win an election. Best and worst bits of political strategy. I mean, the main one, which again is quite relevant at the time of recording, is pick the winner in a leadership election, where it's very much, make sure you're on the right side so you get a decent job.
Although actually, in reality, there is an alternative tactic, isn't it? Which is, don't back the winner, but be one of the most important, powerful supporters of the person who finishes second. Because quite often the new leader, in the spirit of bringing the party together, etc., will need to pick, some people from the beaten side. That is quite a risky strategy if one was to deliberately set out to try to be the most powerful backer of the loser. I can see that would end up with all sorts of James Cleverley like mistakes and disasters flowing. But that is one aspect that actually interesting we've not come across in any of the political fiction we've done for this podcast yet, of the powerful loser having to be accommodated.
Yeah, in Balkan it's party management, and you're almost having to accommodate losers, but from other parties. The show talks about there being two routes to success: sycophancy or rebellion.
Yes, which is that in a way, isn't it?
It's kind of interesting because you can definitely see, just thinking about the Labour side, someone like Jeremy Corbyn is pretty clear with sort of rebellion. Someone like Tony Blair, you'd say, is probably more sycophancy, given, the manifesto he does in 83 is quite different to the one in 97, so it's very much, you rise through. But it's a mixture of both, isn't it? So Keir Starmer, sycophancy as in, served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, wasn't very critical. But then probably the reason why he was elected is that sort of speech to Labour conference where he talks about not ruling out a second referendum on Brexit, which was a little bit of rebellion in amongst the sycophancy. Again, we are recording at a time when Andy Burnham is not yet Prime Minister. And again, the sense you have is, again, someone who served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, served in been a band, served in Gordon Brown. So you could say sycophancy, but then was someone who wielded the knife and showed rebellion at the time when he needed to do so. So you could try and be a sycophant, you could try and be a rebellion, but part of it is kind of knowing when to shift from one to another.
It's obvious that they're just playing the political game, and I recognize this is fiction and it's also TV. But it's not as if Kurzek's going, right, I'm pro-Europe, Lindsay is pro-Europe, Mording is not. So they're not looking at the political positions. They're like, who's got the better chance of winning, which is why he goes to is it PIM, the Clive Swift, what's going on? Where's the wind blowing, to try and find out, how they can position themselves with a winning candidate rather than on policy.
Yeah, he sort of mentions it, but it's almost like a secondary consideration, isn't it? It's like, well, there's no point in, if he's not going to win.
Yes.
Which is not very true to life, given certainly the state of politics at the time that Jeffrey Archer was an MP, and running through to the time when he wrote the novel. Because if you think about the big splits in political parties or switches, they were very policy driven. There may have been obviously some elements of personal ambition and other personal factors involved, but the crux of the Labour pro-European rebellion against Harold Wilson in the early 70s that resulted in people like Roy Jenkins. Roy Jenkins was an ambitious politician, undoubtedly, but the crux of it was real significant disagreements on policy as well, in a way that I think some of the falling outs between people in the last decade in British politics seem to be much more personality driven. I think this is maybe one occasion when we can look back with, the rose-tinted glasses of, everything was a bit more substantial back then. Actually, there is a bit of justification for that.
It's one of the reasons, isn't it, why Gordon Brown, say, stays Prime Minister, is there is no policy difference. Again, I'm kind of stealing the Steve Richards thesis on this, but there was no policy difference, a bit like there was with Thatcher in Europe, where you could say, this is why we're going to get rid of you.
Sometimes it is easy to sort of just glamorize how wonderful politicians in the past were, but I think it is definitely the case that there were real substantive policy disagreements that drove people out of parties or to found new parties and so on, in a way that it's hard to credit Robert Jenrick as being in that same category, really.
I also think what's interesting is obviously the book itself and the TV shows, they don't go into policy so much. I think later on they do with some bigger events. But if you think about it, he was writing for the mass market. He wasn't writing for political nerds like us, because he wouldn't have sold that many. So he was writing for something that was aimed at the general market. Whereas if he'd gone too much into policy, people, if you think about this show, it's a slow burn. It kind of reminds me of The Sandbaggers in some ways, where that's very much the office politics side of espionage. It's not what you see.
That's going to get you in trouble with your fellow espionage fans, Shane, comparing the Sandbaggers to Jeffrey Archer.
Well, I
think what Shane is doing is angling for a quote from when this book is republished in paperback again, I think.
That's right. I mean, more in terms of the production of the show, it's a slow burn that was obviously very popular at the
absolutely,
time.
yeah.
Because there was plenty of budget spent on it. Whereas if he'd gone too much into the policy weeds, maybe it wouldn't have been so successful. And
it's that sense, isn't it, that what you do in episode 1 is you set up the characters rather than in episode 1 you have to start with some dramatic event or twist or to grab the audience's attention. It's a slower and so indeed in the novel, and obviously Jeffrey Archer absolutely knew what he was doing at writing novels that people would leaf through in a bookshop and decide to buy and be riveted by. But the opening line of the novel is Wednesday 10th of April 1931. It's the exact opposite of a moment of drama grabbing you.
Yes.
Another aspect, I guess, of MPs trying to win the support of other MPs by having dinner parties during the last 6 months, when a few people have been jockeying into position before the King of the North rode in to save everything. There were talks of ministers like Shabana Mahmood had been having dinner parties with various backbenchers, sort of building links, and that feels something that's quite.
And dinner parties seem to have been a part of the Keir Starmer story as well.
And that's also quite interesting in this as well. There's that line from Kerslake about Seymour that, he's got the big fancy house in Chelsea, I think it is. And, the wife who's an extremely good host, that's how he's leveraging his money and his wealth and his status with the leadership, candidate, in a way that Kerslake, you see he lives in quite a comfortable home, but nothing like Seymour's. So, he's splashing the cash to influence that the others just don't have.
We're going to splash the cash from the Zeitgeist tape. So production details we liked. Shane, I'm glad that you also noticed smoking at the petrol station.
I mean, would you vote for an MP who was having a cigarette by a petrol pump? I mean, I couldn't believe it when I saw that.
There's a political metaphor somewhere, isn't there?
Yes.
I think my favourite production detail was one I didn't spot at first, but the chap who plays the person who's meant to be Reggie Maudling, so runs for Tory leadership, doesn't get it. The glasses the actor wears are nearly identical to the real Reggie Maudling's glasses. And so I saw the actor and I was trying to place him. I was thinking, he looks a bit familiar. Is it that? And in the end, I realized it's because with the glasses, he looks so much like the real Reggie Maudling.
Yes.
Lovely little detail.
I wasn't sure if it was the glasses. The thing that made me think this is definitely Reggie Maudling is that he was having a stiff drink rather early in the afternoon.
The other thing I like about it, which will segue obviously to a mention of the door, it shows the Houses of Parliament as they were in the 1980s, which was the outside of the building massively blackened by soot and other air pollution over the years. And I've got a jigsaw puzzle of the Houses of Parliament from when I was a kid, which shows them as a building that's black, basically on the outside. And now it's this lovely sort of, I guess, sandstone yellow is probably how you would describe it. And so just seeing, a reminder again of just what air pollution used to do to, and you think, what on earth was it doing to people's lungs if that's what it was doing to buildings? Looks completely different. And of course, production detail that got me most excited was there is a important door, and I think for once you're not going to be able to quibble with the fact that I think there is a door worth commenting on, because of course the really famous door to 10 Downing Street features, and nothing very much notable happens. I mean, it's just used as a door that people use to get into the building and leave the building, but it did remind me of my favourite 10 Downing Street door fact, which is we all think of it as the black door at Downing Street. You know, that's the image that comes to mind. And it has been a black door nearly consistently, except during Asquith's time as Premier, when apparently at his wife's suggestion, he got the door painted a dark green.
So when Zach McClansky becomes Prime Minister.
Exactly. So that can be a future Lib Dem manifesto promise that we will return to the glory days of empire by repainting the Downing Street door. But it's one of those things, isn't it, where now if anyone was to suggest changing the colour, there'd be utter outrage at how could you possibly do this? And yet it used to be possible to do such things without the world falling in.
Have either of you been into number 10?
No.
Been in, is it once or twice? Certainly once I've been in. It's a very odd building inside the little bit that I saw of it. It's just think, how can this actually be where the Prime Minister operates from? But
I'm envious. It's somewhere I'd like to go and have a look around.
But the other thing about that is the outside of Downing Street, the sort of 10 Downing Street, the building, is as blackened as the outside of the Houses of Parliament used to be. But for whatever odd, accidental or deliberate reason, while Parliament has been cleaned up and now is this lovely sort of sandstone yellow, they've done the exact opposite with the outside of 10 Downing Street. Not only have they not cleaned it up, it is actually now painted black to keep that colour on the stonework. So one is deliberately preserved in its polluted form, while the other has been cleaned up. I would obviously, as a parliamentarian rather than a prime minister, like to say I think that's obviously deeply symbolic of, you know, parliamentarians getting it right, cleaning up our act, while the prime ministers are marred in keeping things as they were. But
not much evidence of that over the last 5 years. So I've not shown enough sycophancy or rebellion to enter into Downing Street, sadly. Yeah, there's still time.
Yes. Maybe you'll be recording a podcast from there one day. Let's aim big here, Corey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Record it.
We should find something suitable just in case.
Yes.
There's some good vintage detail, isn't there? So there's good vintage cars. I'm not a massive car person, but there's if you're a fan of vintage cars, there's some good stuff to see. I mentioned Richard Harvey did the music. I have to say, I'm not sure it's one of the great TV theme tunes. It's a bit like Yes Minister as elevator music meets 80s soft rock.
But isn't that what the TV series is in a way?
Yeah.
Were there any other details that particularly grabbed you, Shane? If this was your almost like your education in what politics is like, what else did you pick up?
I think it was the points I raised earlier on, the whipping system, the pairing, for instance, the sets, the swearing in. And I think as we go through the series, because we'll go away now and watch the other 9, I'm sure things will come back to me that I remembered as a 15-year-old thinking, oh, I didn't know about that, and going to find out. So I'm quite excited to delve back into it, to be honest.
Yeah. As somebody whose teenage grasp of the world was shaped by Jeffrey Archer, you've turned out pretty well, I would say, Shane.
Well, I wouldn't say it affected my worldview, but what it did give me was a thirst for political history and, political science, and that's something that's been with me. I mean, we mentioned Spybury earlier on, or I did. For many years, always surprises our listeners that I only started rereading spy books like 10 years ago, because from my kind of mid-teens onwards, I read political history, biographies, and history mainly. So the spy thing is in the last decade. But I do credit First Among Equals for giving me the spark to go and read more books on politics.
And it's quite an interesting window in, I suppose, into the period. And it's interesting, I suppose, especially because they use the actual names of the leaders in the novel. If Netflix were going to do a 10-part, remake, inspired by Rivals, and take up Jeffrey Archer's novels, I wonder if they'd have. Now, I think you'd probably use the real names, wouldn't you? You'd probably have Harold Wilson and you'd have Margaret Thatcher in there. It feels like there's maybe less of a taboo of having those real people than maybe there would have been in the 80s. I don't know. I
fear that in a few years' time, the answer is, well, of course, you'll use the real names because you'll use AI to amend genuine footage of the people to fit in with the fiction that you're producing.
I think also I would add that, and I think probably there's a reason why the book was so successful, is there's soap opera elements to the book. So when you get into the personal lives of the 4, and we've already seen it in episode 1 where he jilts his fiancee to be. So you have that personal interest with the characters, which is important, rather than just 4 robotic politicians. They all have weaknesses, which we'll talk about in another episode. But Mark, I'll just finish with this. In terms of reading Archer at 15 and the effect it had on me, to this day, I've never, ever, ever, ever read another Archer book.
Really? That's the only one that you've read?
That's the only one. And I went to see him, was it earlier this year or last year? I went to see him for a Spectator event hosted by Michael Gove. And the whole reason I went, because my friends give me a hard time for going to that event, but he wrote First Among Equals. I want to hear him talk about it. But not enough that I want to go and read any more of his stuff, like Cain and Abel, which I think is his bestseller.
So I think I've read 2 others. I think I've read Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less. And also a collection of his sort of short stories, which are a bit like Tales of the Unexpected, where you have a sort of dramatic little twist. Like you've got an account of a murder trial where it turns out it's all in the first person account of the murderer who's ended up being the foreman of the jury, and that's the twist in the final paragraph. I know I said no spoilers early on. Apologies that I've now spoiled an obscure Jeffrey Archer short
If you're
story.
halfway through your book of Jeffrey Archer short stories, stop it. It's too late. We're really sorry.
But he's one of those authors who's just really faded from sort of attention. You know, having been I've got to read it out. It's this wonderful mix of bombast and modesty. So at the back of the paperback edition that I've got, First Among Equals, it says, Jeffrey Archer is now established as Britain's greatest storyteller, ranking in the top 10 storytellers in the world. I think that's a bit down on Britain, saying that if our top storyteller only just makes it into the top 10.
But by books sold, he probably is, because Gove came out with some stat. I think he's published more, or there's more books printed of his than anyone else, or something. There was some stat, I can't remember it now.
Oh yeah, I can easily imagine that.
It's funny, we mentioned earlier on about MP salaries. There was one comment that night which had us all giggling. So we're talking about, you know, the state of British politics today and the people involved, etc. And Archer said he'd been at an event with women business leaders, and this woman was giving him a really hard time. And he said to her in front of everyone, he said, look, you're obviously very intelligent. You know your way around politics. You know, why aren't you in the cabinet? You're the type of person we need. And this woman turned around and said, well, because I earn 400 grand a year and I have 3 lovers. That was a great answer. Why on earth would she get into British politics? Like, yeah.
I mean, that sounds...
So, Corey, I think Shane's blown the whistle on both of our private lives, given that we are both in politics in different ways. We, however, will let listeners speculate as to which elements of that formula we don't match and to what degree.
Yes.
Put a comment on the Substack link on this post with your ill-informed speculations.
Your speculations, yes.
Speaking of ill-informed speculations, final item is State of Play. Bit of a rating. Would we recommend it? Shane, do you want to kick us off? How did you find returning to this after a few decades out?
Well, obviously it's very dated as a TV show, and you've got to go in with that premise. But for me, it still stood up. It was still an engaging story. At the finale of episode 1, where you've got Kerslake doing a death stare at Seymour, and that line, "Oh, you picked the wrong man." You know, it's a good cliffhanger to think, well, now I want to watch the second episode. I want to know what happens to these guys. So I think it is still mission accomplished. Yes, it's slow. It's a slow burn. It doesn't have the special effects and the bombast of modern television, which is why I kind of equate it to Sandbaggers, which is a slow burn. It's as opposite from James Bond as you can get, but still a brilliant show. So for me, it stands up. The only thing I have is I did wonder, should I read the book again? But I just remember the book being so the TV show being so faithful to the book that I don't think I need to read the book again. Certainly not the American edition.
I think you would enjoy reading the book again, or at least dipping into it, I suspect, because I've not read it again, but I have dipped into it a little bit. Partly there's the fun that I'm pretty sure the plot has a different ending, but things like in the beginning of the book, there's a little bit more about each of the characters in the setup, and you can see both Jeffrey Archer's skill as a novelist. In setting that up, but also actually the skill of the TV adaptation of how they've boiled down that beginning to the core essence of what you need to present 4 characters fairly succinctly to a new audience for the first time. So yeah, I would definitely recommend dipping into the book if you enjoy enjoy
Right.
the TV series. Although it is, yeah, a lot of it is. I guess it reminds me a little bit of J.K. Rowling's writing. You know, when you start looking at it with a slightly more reflective eye, rather than
Mhm.
greedily reading it to get through the plot to find out what's going to happen, you sort of think, yeah, this is not. How on earth did the Scotsman end up comparing Jeffrey Archer to Trollope? I really do not know.
Yes. There is one great line in this that really struck with me, and I'm pretty sure it's in the book as well, when Fraser is getting ready to go down to London and he's with his dad, and his dad is a lifelong Tory. And the dad is like, "But you've been a conservative all your life." And he turns around and says, "No, father, you've been a conservative all my life." And you
Oh
do
yes, that
wonder
is a
how many
great line.
families, because, my parents' politics were different from my own, and most people I know,
Mm,
um, certainly those who get involved in politics might have different politics than their family. But I thought it was just a great line. He's
mm,
assumed all his life that he's a Tory, and he's on the left.
And I guess especially now in a time when age is one of those dividing sort of things that you can start inferring people's party affiliation from age,
mm.
maybe is yeah, more relevant now probably than it was in the 80s, actually. Shane, if on our actually very appropriate for this episode, ranking of 0 to 650, do you want to give a rating for this, or are you going to pass judgment until you've watched all 10 episodes?
Right. I will say right now, so 650 is the top score, right? Not zero.
Yeah.
So I would say right now I'm still scoring it at 650. Now let's see where I land by the time we get to episode.
North Korean style landslide
Great.
there.
I mean,
I think you've got that by-election returning officer counting the votes. So I've got
yeah.
really mixed feelings about what score to give it, because at first, I must admit, my heart sank a little bit. I went, oh my goodness, this guest has suggested a 10-hour thing. Where am I going to find the time for it? But I really enjoyed watching the hour, and I'm really looking forward to now having to find the time to watch the other 9 hours. So that's a really big plus point. And I have leafed through the novel. I've read bits of the novel, so that's a really good plus point. And it's just fun in a very lightweight. It's a bit like, I guess, asking me to rate a McDonald's filet o fish sandwich on a sort of cooking podcast. You know, it's quite nice, it's quite fun, but I really don't give it actually that higher score. So I think in the end, I've certainly enjoyed watching it more than, say, our Iranian football movie Offside, but it's clearly not as good an act of artistic creation as Offside. So I've given it a 320 in the end. I'm intrigued now. Where between 320 and 650 have you ended up, Corey?
Well, I'm between those two, but nearer one side than the other. So, yeah, it's very entertaining. It's more of a trashy soap opera type show than I was expecting. I think we have, in terms of a score, we sort of have to approach it conceptually, really. And so this is an episode that is based around the 1964 election. This episode essentially does what that election did. What it does is set you up for the whole series. So, this first episode gives you a good grounding, because as you say, it's such a slow burn, Shane. It gives you that good grounding into those four characters. You get a eye into their private lives and their relationship with their wives and their relationships with each other, and sets up the political drama that I imagine comes through. And so in that sense, just as in 1966, Wilson then gets a bigger majority with a snap election, like this lays the groundwork. And then I'm hoping, I might give it a higher score. There's a potential for a higher score in future episodes. So problem is, of course, that the House of Commons in 1964 only had 630 seats, of which Labour won 317. So therefore, we have to do some weighting to adjust the fact under our system there are 650.
I'm really regretting having come up with the 0 to 650 counting scale now. It's one of my worst ideas.
But having done that, the weighting suggests that therefore I would give this episode 327 out of 650. That would be the appropriate weighting when we put this out next time, seeing what we think of all of it. Shane, thank you so much for suggesting it. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
And recording this has been a lot of fun.
Despite my score, I have really enjoyed watching it, and are really looking forward to watching more episodes. And obviously, listeners should rush out and watch not just the first episode, but more episodes as well, because we will return to the rest of the series in a later podcast episode. So you can catch all of the series on YouTube. We'll include a link to the high definition version. There is also a low definition version up there, but we'll include a link to the high definition version so you can gorge it all for free over the summer.
Makes me wonder which one I've chosen. Actually, did I watch the low or the high one? The fact that I can't tell tells you a lot. Thank you very much, Shane. Shane, do you want to talk about how good Spybury is and why people should be reading and or listening to it?
Well, this is the reason why I'd be an awful politician, because I haven't got my talking points ready, other than to say, if you enjoy spy fiction, if you enjoy espionage history, we have a podcast at Spybury on all good podcast apps and YouTube. We have a very engaged Facebook community and a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. So if you're interested in discovering new spy books, or maybe you want to renew an interest in that side of things, then Spybury is there for you.
And we'll pop a link to that in the show notes, and we'll also pop a link in our newsletter.
Yeah, and you may have to restrain me from including a link to the previous episode of the Spybury podcast, on which I talked about my 5 favourite espionage novels. But seriously, if people are interested in espionage novels, it's a really lovely Facebook group in particular. It's one of those Facebook groups where you can, ask a genuine question about something that people will have very strongly held views on, and you'll just get an interesting discussion back rather than a sort of torrent of people getting very wound up. So, for example, I will confess that perhaps the most significant spy fiction of the last few years has been the Slow Horses series. I read the first novel, didn't enjoy it at all. And it's the sort of Facebook group where you can post the question of, I didn't enjoy this, what have I missed? And got a really interesting discussion rather than what you'll get in most places online, which is a whole stream of sort of hate and anger. So huge thanks for all of the work you do cultivating such a lovely community. Really encourage people to go and join.
Thank you. And what's interesting, to tie it into your work, and I have to say, the Mutual Beneficial Society here with compliments, but I really enjoyed listening to your episode. So do keep up the good work with this podcast. What has surprised me is because Tim Shipman, who many of your listeners will be familiar with, is on our Spybury board, and he wrote the ranking of top 125 spy authors, which I highly recommend everyone go and download. Because he occasionally retweets Spybury, it means we have quite a lot of politicos that listen to the show. So often surprises me, I get an email from notable politicians saying, I really enjoyed your episode with such and such. And I remember it happened once with Liam Byrne, when I'd gone to one of his committee meetings, and I'd really enjoyed it because I'd never been to a committee meeting before. And actually, I think for anyone listening, that's where the action is. That's not the pantomime of the chamber. It's what happens in committee. And he's like, "Oh, I'm a listener of Spybury," because I'd obviously. I'm always really surprised when politicians listen to the show. So and also very flattered.
Well, I'm going to have to lie down and recover from Mark's Slow Horses revelation. So we're going to have to bring this quickly to a close. But I completely agree about the Spybury Facebook group, if not necessarily Mark's views on Mick Herron's novels.
Controversial revelation. Let's end the episode.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Speak to you soon.